This conference will now be recorded.
Greetings, everyone. Welcome back to another thrill-packed session of solid information from my brother Steve and myself on what we're calling Brothers in Arms. And we are uh, using Proverbs 17:17 as our text. A friend loves at all times, and a brother is born for adversity. And Gary J is assisting us behind the scenes some now, but he will be on screen at some point, probably after his tax season. But today, what we're doing on these sessions is trying to go a little bit more in depth on the weekly or daily and weekly Bible readings of the Liberty Church that we're going through the Bible. And the downside of that is we're challenged to cover so many chapters each session. Now it's going to slow down some as we get more into the building of the tabernacle and their journey in the wilderness and all that. We won't be covering hundreds and hundreds of years in each session. That's been a challenge. So this will probably be the last one that we're just overwhelmed with many events, many dates, many time periods, trying to do it in one session. It's interesting. I went back and looked at Mike Maney from Missoula, Montana, and I did sessions several years ago. We called it Truth Be Told. And we went through the books of Moses, but we went more in depth. You know, we were not bound by the constraints of daily Bible reading of how many chapters we had to cover. And so I went back and looked, and we covered Exodus 1 through 15 is what we're going to cover today. Uh, and it took us 17 one-hour sessions to cover those 16 chapters. So less than a chapter a session. And Steve and I are going to try to cover all of them. So we apologize if we don't cover maybe some of your favorite parts, or we don't deal with all of it because it just is impossible in an hour. But we're going to hit some high points. We're going to hit the things that kind of stood out to us as we read through with our wives each day. So some of what we bring up, maybe some things our wives mentioned to us in our early morning times together reading through these chapters. But Exodus 1 through 15 uh, is, covers, of course, the birth of Moses all the way to the Exodus. So it covers an 80-year period or even a little more. It starts out before he was born. And it covers just a lot of major events that we'll just try to deal with as best we can. But the word Exodus, of course, the name of the book means a way out, means exit. That is their exodus or way out of Egypt. And of course, their way out was through the power, the mercy, and the love of God through the plagues and through his leadership. But it's also the start of their journey toward the promised land and entering into it 40 years after they left under Joshua. So it really is the principle that we like to bring up of Deuteronomy 6:23. I brought you out that I might bring you in. And so this is the way out of Egypt. So a big idea of deliverance. And of course, that is through blood, through water, through manna, through the leadership of the pillar of cloud by day and fire by night, bringing them quickly to Mount Sinai. And then they camped out there for about a year as they were getting the law from God with Moses up and down on Mount Sinai. But Moses, of course, is a great Messiah figure, one of the great Messiah figures of the Old Testament, of a deliverer, of an intercessor, of a warrior, of a leader. Many of the great qualities of Christ to his church today, to his people, are found in Moses and Israel out of Egypt. Also, the idea of rejection when he finally went back at 80 years old and told the elders and the leaders of Israel why he was there, and then he went before Pharaoh to try to bring it about. He was rejected by both parties because things didn't go so well. So, very much like Christ, he was rejected by the Roman government and by the nation of Israel. Moses was rejected by the Egyptian government and the children of Israel. So, very much a Christ figure in that. He As Brother Richard Harless, that Steve and I grew up under at the airport church, he used to love to say about Moses that his life was divided into three spans of 40 years each. The first 40 years, he learned that he was somebody, as Pharaoh's daughter, brought up in the household of Pharaoh, taught in all the knowledge of the Egyptians, Stephen said in Acts chapter 7. So just very well educated, very well trained for leadership, to play a powerful role, to be elevated in government, to understand government structure, how groups of people should operate efficiently. He learned all that the first 40 years in it, and it was valuable as he led them across the wilderness. But there was a lot he did not learn in those first 40 years, and it took the next 40 years learning that he was nobody. In essence, an insignificant shepherd in the backside of the desert, taking care of his father-in-law's flocks. It doesn't even say they were his flock, Moses' flocks. We don't know how much he uh, had as possessions. Maybe not very much at all. He was able to leave everything behind and go back down to Egypt. It doesn't say he took a whole lot of animals and people and possessions with him. So he was a shepherd, not powerful in the sense he was the first 40 years, not wealthy, not influential. And yet that was what God needed to add to his character in order for him, because that 40 years was key in him taking them across the wilderness. He knew that area of the world like the back of his hand, even though they had the cloud pillar by cloud pillar of cloud by day and fire by night. Moses still knew that land and knew everything about it, the details of it that helped. So 40 years to learn he was somebody, 40 years to learn he was nobody. And then his brother Harless got that little grin on his face. And then the final 40 years to learn how that God could take nobody and make somebody out of them. And that has always stuck with me and Steve throughout our life. And I think it's a pretty accurate way of looking at the life of Moses. He did not become their deliverer as a rich, powerful man his first 40 years, even though he thought that might be the case. That might be how God, because the Hebrews 11 and Acts 7 explains that he kind of understood what his calling was. He knew that God's hand was on him in some way to deliver the people. And he kind of tried to take it on himself when he killed the Egyptian, and then he tried to bring peace between two Israelite people. And they said, "Who has made you to be a ruler and judge over us?" And that's when he had to flee. But there was something in his mind that he probably wondered, it's in this position as powerful ruler that God's going to use me to deliver them. And God had to show him, no, it's as humble shepherd. That's what I'm really looking for in order for you to deliver them. So just a lot of great lessons to us about the kind of person God is looking for, not in our own abilities and strength and power and wealth, but in submission to him, even being reluctant like Moses was when God wanted him to go back, trying to get out of it. And yet that's the kind of person God's looking for in a sense, a person who does not see themselves as the obvious choice, but actually sees themselves as not the obvious choice. And that's the first two sets of Moses' 40 years. Anyway, there's a lot more to say about that, but that's kind of an introduction that I want to give. And Steve has some interesting timeline information that I think will be very helpful about the overall time period of their time in Egypt, their deliverance, and how that's spelled out in the scripture. So, Steve, take it over.
I feel like I need to start off with a disclaimer stating that you'll need to come to conclusions yourself. But I'll give you some things to think about as we consider the time frame between when we read last week where Joseph died, being 110 years old in Egypt, and then when we pick up in Genesis, especially in Genesis chapter 2, when Moses was born. And we know that he was 80 when he finally started leading the children of Israel out of Egypt. So we have some time we can throw together and come up with some possibilities. So how much time had passed from the end of the book of Genesis to at least Genesis, the second chapter? Joseph had died. He was 110, and it restates that again in the first chapter of Exodus, the 6th verse. But according to the 7th verse, that was a time of abundant growth and prosperity for the children of Israel. In fact, so much abundant growth that they got the attention of Pharaoh. So there was prosperity at least through the life of Joseph and maybe a little beyond before that started deteriorating. So those are some times to think about when we consider talking about the 400 or the 430 years Israel was in Egypt. How much of that was really under adverse conditions and how much was not? We may make some blanket statements, but this study has at least caused me to think about being careful about making blanket statements about 400 years of taskmasters and being abused as slaves and so forth. So there's some various evidences that would suggest that affliction on the Hebrews was maybe really didn't start until the 200-year mark of the 400 to 460 years, whichever one you lean towards, because we have statements of both. So maybe about half of the time there. So that's some suggestions that we could consider. So maybe halfway through some affliction, and then more affliction as time moved on, when it was seen that the affliction didn't derail the blessings of God on his people. In fact, they may have increased, and the births may have increased after the affliction was put upon them. There seems to be some read between the lines that you can read in the scriptures about that. But in Genesis, the 15th chapter, starting with verse 13 through 16, the Lord tells Abraham that you know for certain that your offspring will be sojourners in the land that is not theirs, and will be servants there. So there's the announcement to Abraham. They will be afflicted for 400 years, Genesis 15 says, but I will bring judgment on the nation that they serve, and afterwards they shall come out with great possessions, and we know they did. And they will come back here in the 4th generation. So the 4th generation would be something for us to consider when we think about how many years they were in Egypt and when did the time start that they were in Egypt. There's different ideas about generations, but if we literally take a literal view of the time of Abraham, even up until the time of Moses, they were still living typically over 100 years, 100, 120 years, sometimes 147 years like Abraham did. And so, what did the generation mean would be for you to determine in your own studies. It says that also in those verses that you'll be back here in the 4th generation, for the iniquity of the Amorites is not yet complete. Rick might cover that thought, I'm not sure, but there's at least two major predictions that help us explain the 400 or the 460 year period. So when did the 430 years start? In our reading this last week, a couple verses that stood out to me was after the Passover was initiated. So on the 14th month of the month of Abib, so in early spring. It says in Exodus 12:40, now the sojourning of the children of Israel who dwelt in Egypt was 430 years. Verse 41 says, and it came to pass at the end of 430 years, even the self-same day. So exactly 430 years, that all the host of the Lord went out of the land of Egypt. And then 51 restates it. It came to pass the self-same day that the Lord did bring the children of Israel out of the land of Egypt by their armies. So we know that would be the 15th day, Passover being the 14th day. On the 15th day, they departed. So early spring. This would be the point where we should be able to go back 430 years and determine when in God's plan did the clock start counting. It's important maybe for us to note what Paul said about this occasion in Galatians 3. He says, and this I say, that the law, which was 430 years later after what? After the promise to Abraham. That's the subject there. Cannot annul the covenant that was confirmed before by God in Christ. So Paul stated that the law came 430 years after the covenant God made with Abraham. So, as Rick would maybe be fond of saying, this could be a timestamp if we were looking at a start date or start time, that it would be 430 years before Moses would receive the law. So we could go back from that point and determine some times. However, there's at least two other passages that refer to the 400-year period. Then he said to Abraham, know certainly that your descendants will be strangers in the land that is not theirs, and will serve them, and they will afflict them 400 years. Stephen, in his message in Acts 7, also said that God spoke in this way, that his descendants, Abraham's, would dwell in a foreign land, and they would bring them into bondage and oppress them for 400 years. So Stephen uses in his message 400 years. So I'm going to go ahead and share a couple of views that I did some research on, and there's more than the 4 or 5 that I'm going to share if you want to go look them up yourself, if we want to put some time frames on it. I was taught as a young man early on that the 430 years versus the 400 years would include the 30 years that Joseph was in Egypt prior to Jacob, and the 70 go in there, so that would entail the 430 years versus the 400 years. That would be when the clock had started, when he was 17 years old. That fits pretty good, but has some difficulties when you start digging in a little bit deeper and looking at some generally expected or accepted exit dates. You kind of have to squish some time into there. And especially if you go start looking at who possibly were the pharaohs during those events, as some have concluded that there's a narrower space between Joseph and the departure than 430 years. In some cases, much narrower than the 430 years. So, if this is the correct position, that 430 years includes Joseph, and we do the math to the time between Genesis 50 and the death of Joseph, and Exodus, the 2nd chapter, the birth of Moses, if we want to do the math, and this became clearer to me when I actually grabbed a piece of paper, got a ruler, and made a timeline. And I put 430 years for this position, and then I started putting known births and deaths on that timeline. And so when I did that, it appears to me that between the death of Joseph, if this position is right, and the birth of Moses. So that between the death of Joseph and the birth of Moses, there is only a 257-year gap. And we already know that they were prosperous through the time of Joseph. So, maybe we can narrow that time of affliction to 257 years that they were in Egypt. But maybe we can narrow it even more than that, because maybe it was sometime after Joseph that the heavy affliction came. So that's one point that could be shared. When you go online and look at those information for those who have studied it deeper, where they've looked at historical thoughts that may be connected to the events, there's two main approaches that can be looked at. The length of the Egyptian sojourn, how long they were in Egypt. The majority of that debate surrounds where the clock started for the sojourn. Advocates of the long 430 from the time of Joseph going down, for instance, would place the entire 430 years in Egypt. So now you have to start backing up to where Abraham lived, or you have to start pushing out the Exodus time that maybe others have concluded would be the true time of the Exodus, or more accurate time of the Exodus. So that's the long-term view, which would then lead, when you start looking at the pharaohs of Egypt at that time, it would push it out to various pharaohs based upon your position. So that would be a long-term position, but a short-term view or short-term sojourn. So I mentioned that if Joseph is the time of 257 years after Joseph died, would Moses be born? If we even push that a little narrow to where the sojourn view holds that 430 years began when Abraham was in Canaan. So when he first came down to Canaan, and we could even include at this point the time that he went to Egypt. So the time that he went to Egypt seems to be kind of a popular view when you go looking. So he received the promise in Genesis 12. There was a famine, and in that same chapter he goes down to Egypt. So almost, we could say the same age. So if we take that view, let me do some math for you here. The period of Israel sojourn in Egypt was much shorter, or approximately 215 years. So instead of I mentioned the 257 years a while ago, maybe it was 215 years. So the short term would include the time that Jacob arrived. And in order to calculate the 215 years, we can start with Abraham was 75 years old when he received the covenant. So if this is the position you want to consider, Abraham was 75 years old when he received the covenant in Genesis 12. Following this, 25 years later was Isaac's birth. So you could, now you're taking that time, 25 years off of the 400 or 430, whatever position you take. Then Jacob was born 60 years later to Isaac, as in Genesis 25. And eventually Jacob sojourns in Egypt at the age of 130. So Jacob is 130 when he goes into Egypt, and Joseph is about 40 at that point. So the sum total of these years, so the 25 years between the promise, if that's the position you take, and the birth of Isaac, and then Isaac was 60 when he had Jacob, and Jacob was 130 when he went into Egypt, you are already at the 215-year mark. So 215 years out of the 430, you're at the halfway mark, as I mentioned a while ago, that some people conclude that things were not difficult until the middle of that 430 years. So, that's something to consider. If you want to even extend that out a little bit to where Joseph lives another 70 years after Jacob got there. So now you deduct that 70 years of the time of Joseph. You only have a 145-year gap between the death of Joseph and the early events of the book of Exodus. So that time of affliction may even be shorter than some of us may think. So those are just some things to consider. I'll move and do a couple more real quick. The other folks kind of feel. Some have said, when I looked it up, that the timestamp didn't start until Isaac was born. In other words, the statement to God, to Abraham, would be dependent on Abraham's descendants, and Abraham didn't have a descendant at the time of that promise. And so some people would start that clock 25 years after the promise. So you can, if it's a position that you want to take, that would be fine. That position also has a part B to it, that maybe it really didn't start until Isaac was 5 years old, 6 years old. So Abraham received the promise at 25 years prior, and then Isaac would be born. And remember, when Isaac was about 5 years old or so, that's when they were told to separate from the handmaid, from the bondwoman's child that was in the house. So that separation between Ishmael and Isaac at that point, that would be the point of the start of the clock, because it was dependent on a descendant. Abraham was told that his descendants would be in that land of bondage. One article I read suggests that, well, I can go on. There's some more that you can look at if you want to yourself. Anyway, you will need to come to your own conclusion on that. I looked at some of the pharaohs, some of the interesting things, and you kind of get buried in this. Some of the interesting things that I looked at was looking at the pharaohs. When I looked at the pharaohs, the possible pharaohs during the time of Joseph, one I navigated towards was, it said he was very prosperous during this time, and that he gained lands and territories. Well, that fits really well to the time of Joseph being prime minister to me, a historical reason. And then when I looked at possible pharaohs during the time of the Exodus, there is one that stood out, that he had lost his, I think it said his son, but it possibly said his firstborn son. That the records show that his firstborn son died as a very young boy. So that could fit into the time of the Exodus and the time of the Passover, for sure. So you can get really buried looking at this information, but it kind of helped me understand maybe a little better. I'm not looking at a 400 or 430 year gap from the time Jacob got there to the time of their Exodus, and that the time there was all bad. I'm leaning now towards doing some of this research that more than 50% of the time was prosperous. They were having babies like crazy. I don't think the midwives necessarily were lying when they were told to kill the babies, and they say that, hey, they pop out way too fast. We can't get there in time. I kind of feel like it's the story that we have in Genesis, when the blessings upon, was it Jacob, that the lambs and the sheep and are bearing children fast. There's no miscarriage among them. type thing. So I kind of feel like that's the time we can refer to even to the children of Israel in Goshen, that as time went on and time got closer to leave, that the midwives were true in their statement that God was blessing in such a way that the women were not miscarriaging, they were conceiving quickly and bearing quickly, and God was blessing them tremendously. So that being said, no conclusions for me about exactly the time stamps and the time frames, but I do lean towards, after doing some of this research, a narrower, much more narrow time of affliction for the children of Israel and a longer time of prosperity. So any thoughts on that, Rick?
Uh, yeah, you stirred up a lot of thoughts. I appreciate all that you said and given the various viewpoints. You know, we're talking about a history that's almost 4,000 years old. So it's very difficult to go back that far and to be certain about anything really. And I appreciate what you said about the midwives, the babies popping out. They said these Jewish women are more lively, you know, because one of the blessings God promised to them was the blessings of the womb, and I think that's part of it. Um, I have studied this. First of all, let me just say that some of you watching this or listening to this have tuned out because you think it's too much in the weeds, the details of it too hard to figure out. But others of you are inspired by it to do more research on your own. It's just different people are different. You know, it's just that's the way it is. And people like me and Steve, now that we're retired from our secular jobs, we still stay very busy with many other things, of course. But it is a blessing to be able to chase those rabbits that you didn't have time to chase when you had a secular job on top of everything. And I've often said this about myself. I like to think I'm a history geek about dates and the details of history, but I am nothing compared to our good brother Eric Cooper. And I imagine he could do 2 or 3 hours worth on what Steve just went through and give all the reasons for each position. So if you want to hit up Eric to see what his opinion is, be my guest. But I've studied a lot of different historians, chronologists, so-called experts on ancient history, Bible history. And like Steve said, they're all over the place. They all have reasons for their positions. But one man that I've really come to appreciate, and what you have to do in Bible study eventually, in especially Old Testament history, is to find a historian that you really think you have confidence in and just kind of stick with that person. Uh, and some things they may be right, some things they may be wrong, but if you feel like they do a real good job of research and state their opinions clearly, then it's good to stay attached to them. And for a number of years, I've become attached to a man named Floyd Nolan Jones, and he has a chronology of the Old Testament history. You can get it online. You can download the whole thing PDF. It's a little cumbersome to go through it that way because it's many hundreds of pages. I purchased it and I have it all marked up, and I've really gained a lot of information from his research. I would say this: my conclusion has become the 430 years begins with Genesis 12, and the Exodus then is 430 years later. Uh, that is really when the sojourn, you know, we sometimes try to make the whole sojourn to be in Egypt, but his whole sojourn was after he left his family in Haran, came down into Canaan land. Immediately there was a famine and he went to Egypt. So we could say the starting point is when the covenant is made in Genesis 12, or we could say it was the first time him and his bloodline became connected to Egypt and the difficulties that arose. Because when he went down there, everything was fine. But then, of course, there was a conflict between him and Pharaoh regarding Sarah. and Pharaoh wanted him to leave. So that could be seen as kind of a beginning of the conflict between Egypt and the bloodline of Abraham. And Steve said that then the 400 years could be from the time Isaac was weaned at 5 years old. So the 430 starts with the promise given to Abraham when he came into the land, or soon after his time that he went down into Egypt. And then 30 years later is when Isaac was weaned. And the importance of that is, and then that gets us to 400 minus, different than the 430. Is that's when Ishmael mocked him. And so that was also then the idea of the mocking of the non-covenant people toward the covenant people. And of course, Ishmael was born from an Egyptian woman, and he married an Egyptian woman. So that whole tie-in between Ishmael mocking Isaac, because it was at the weaning stage that it became official that they were the heir of their father. Because during history, so many babies died their first 5 years. So you really didn't make it official till they were weaned. You felt like they were over the dangerous period of childbirth, diseases, and all of that. And once they were weaned, then there was a much better chance of them growing to adulthood and being able to inherit after their father died. So that kind of takes care of the 400 and 430, the 30-year difference. When Abram was 75 when he came into the land, and he was 105 when Isaac was weaned. So that's the 30-year difference. So I would mainly take two verses. First of all, that verse you started out with in Exodus 12 and 40. I want to point out something that is easily overlooked when you read it. When it says, "Now the sojourn of the children of Israel who lived in Egypt was 430 years." Now it's kind of tricky, the wording of it, and it kind of fools you. It did me for many years. It does not say they were in Egypt for 430 years. It says the sojourn period, the overall sojourn period of them coming into the land, eventually going to Egypt and so forth, is all called the sojourn, even before they went down to Egypt with Jacob and Joseph. But it doesn't say they were 430 years in Egypt. It says their sojourn was 430 years of the people who were in Egypt. So they ended up in Egypt. It's kind of tricky. You have to kind of slowly read through it and realize it's not really saying what I always thought it said, that their sojourn in Egypt was 430. But if you go back to Abraham going to Egypt during the famine, that would be 430. You could use this verse that way. But the key verse that Steve read in Galatians 3:17, so that's on one side of the Exodus, leading up to the Exodus. It says that the law came 430 years after Genesis 12, after Abram received the covenant when he came into the land. So we're pretty sure that Abraham was born around 2000 BC. He was 75, so that brings us to 1925 or so. And then you go forward 430 years. If you round these numbers off, if you make it from 1900 to 430 being maybe 400, rounded off at 400, and the covenant to Abram being at 1900. Just easier to kind of get it settled in your mind. Then the Exodus was around 1500 BC. I mean, just that simple math almost makes it necessary that if the time of Abraham's life, especially at 75 years old, is something around 1900, and then about 430 years later, they came out of Egypt, you're around 1500. So that kind of sets within parameters of several years the time of the Exodus. And the other thing that really settles it is that verse in 1 Kings chapter 5 is a really important verse on this because it's precise also. uh, uh, 1 Kings 6, excuse me, 1 Kings 6 and 1. And it came to pass in the 480th year, after the children of Israel had come out of the land of Egypt, in the fourth year of Solomon's reign over Israel, that he began to build the house of God. So there's a precise time stamp. So we do know that Solomon became king, again, rounding it off just to make it easy, around 1000 BC. So if you add or you go backwards in time 480 years, rounded off to 500, just to make it simple again, you're back to about 1500 BC. So these two verses on either side, Abraham's life to the Exodus, Solomon starting the temple around 1000 BC, backwards about 500 years. Both of them take you to about 1500 BC. So that's kind of the conclusion I've drawn. Just in a real, to me, it's just a real simple, straightforward. But I enjoy going into all these details and the reasons people give, and I know some people listening to this, you'll maybe have your own rebuttal. But to me, that makes it real simple. It kind of explains the difference between 400 and 430 years. It explains the difference of the early dates and later dates of the Exodus that people like to argue about. I'll just say one more thing before we move on. We don't want it all to be about the dating and everything. But Steve, I think, rightly pointed out that if you take it back to the time of Genesis 12 as the starting point, then the time Jacob moved his whole family into Egypt, interestingly, is 215 years. So
Mhm.
from the time, so that's half of the 430, exactly half. So from Abraham to Jacob going into Egypt is 215 years. And then from Jacob going in to the Exodus is 215 years. That kind of cuts it in half nicely. And the reason that's important is because, as Steve pointed out, uh, it wasn't until not only Joseph died, but the knowledge or the influence of Joseph. So sometime after Joseph died, they became slaves. So it'd even be something less than 215 years. As Steve said, it probably built over time, but uh, in essence, it's at least 80 years because it was before Moses was born that they had become slaves. But it's something less than 215 from the time Jacob went in, probably quite a bit less, maybe at least 50 years or 100 years or something. So maybe the actual slavery was something between 100 and 150 years time period. We say that takes away a lot of the strength of that whole idea of them being slaves. You're trying to cut it down to a shorter time. Not if you're that generation that's the slaves. It's pretty bad. Uh, so, for them, it was terrible. And, and a lot of this too, and I know Steve ran into this when he was studying, and I don't want to get into this in detail. Again, Eric Cooper, if you listen to this, you can do several hours sessions on not only the timing of all this. I'm sure he has it. I know I've heard him say who exactly the Pharaoh is, what dynasty it was, and of course, there's a great study about a group of people uh, who became in control of Egypt for a few hundred years. They're called the Hyksos, Hyksos. Uh, and it's a fact of history, and it's a good study. And interesting thing about the Hyksos is they were Semite people, like the Israelite people were. And that may be part of the reason why they were treated so well during the first part of their time. And so when it says a Pharaoh arose who did not know Joseph, there was a time just before the Exodus, or a number of years before the Exodus, that the Hyksos rulers were overthrown and the Egyptians took back control, the blood Egyptians. And that's probably when the whole persecution, slavery time started. And so take that for what it's worth. We've thrown out a lot of dates, a lot of details, a lot of verses, a lot of history. I find it fascinating. But we understand that a lot of you are listening, driving in your car, taking a walk, or whatever. You're not in a place where you can start doing a lot of research on this. And for some of you, a lot of this is not even interesting. But we're the ones doing the podcast, and it's interesting to us. So that's all we can do. If we try to tailor every one of these sessions according to what we think a lot of you want, then that would not be genuine or sincere. So all we can do is just share with you what we find interesting. And if you think that a lot of this is not of interest to you, just move on, fast forward, whatever you need to do, and we won't take offense at it. So anyway, take all that for what it's worth. Uh, a lot of this reading, chapters 1 through 15, is, of course, about Moses and the burning bush, which could be a whole session in itself. It's great. I did wonder this time, I hadn't thought about this so much before. It's not as if Moses had not been in that area before taking care of the sheep. So evidently he had traveled around Mount Sinai probably fairly often. Uh, it's not like he was lost. It's not like he was out of his normal pattern or anything. And he saw that burning bush. And as I like to say, the Bible says he turned aside. And there are times in our life, because we like to add devotional thoughts to these sessions, there are times in our life when God gets our attention and we turn aside. And once we turn aside, there's no turning back. And that could be a call to preach. It could be, of course, your salvation. It could be greater dedication, mission work. It could be a number of things. Closer walk with God. Sometimes God gets our attention in life. We've been going along. We've been going to church, thinking that we're serving Him. We've been praying, reading the Bible. But there are times in our life God really gets our attention with a burning bush event, and we turn aside to look, and we're never the same after. And Moses was never the same after. So I
In
like.
that in that same event, a devotional thought that came to me that I appreciated was, and those of us that feel like we have limited abilities when it comes to public speaking, and I've heard even preachers say this, is when Moses said in the fourth chapter, verse 12, "Oh my Lord, I'm not eloquent." Let me actually read it here instead of thinking I can quote it. Hold on a second. Apologize for this. I have my notes up, but they're all over the place. Neither before nor since you have spoken to your servant, but I'm slow of speech and slow of tongue. So the Lord said to him, "Who has made your mouth? Or who has made the mute, the deaf, the seeing, the blind? Have not I, the Lord?" In verse 12 of chapter 4. Now therefore go. So go, there's the command to go. So that turning aside and getting the commission, you'll never be the same. "And I will put in your mouth and teach you what you shall say." That's an important principle that a lot of us have found some encouragement by, especially when we tie it to things like in Matthew and in John, where the Lord says, in John, where the Lord says, "I'm going to send you the Holy Spirit and He'll teach you all truth." And then, in Matthew 10, when He sends the disciples out, He says, "I'm going to send you in the midst of sheep among wolves. Therefore be wise as serpents and harmless as doves, but beware of men. They will deliver you up to councils. You will be brought before governors," and so forth. But He also goes on to say, don't worry about what you're going to speak, for it will be given to you in that hour that you should speak. So that same thought drawn from a devotional thought from Moses saying, I'm not the guy, and don't worry about it. As we go, the Lord will give us what we need to say and what we need to speak. And we've even found in that verse in Matthew that as a kind of a encouraging verse for us as we move towards difficult times, maybe even towards the end times. Keep our head in the Word, keep our eyes reading the Word, keep our hearts right, and the Lord's going to give us the answer. He's going to give us what we need in the time that we need it. The Spirit's going to remind us and teach us what to say in that day. So that's just a devotional thought to spring off what you said.
And I might even add to that then. God, it took 80 years for God to prepare Moses for 40 years as their deliverer. That's really a good thing to think about as you go through your life serving God, and you think, well, God, I want God to use me for something big and important. But God just wants faithfulness along the way. He just wants you to put him first, and it's up to him how he's going to use you. And it may be later in life, and we have examples in the Bible that at the end of their life, the last stages of their life, that they did their greatest work. But it was up to God to say it was time for Moses to go back and deliver the people. And so the first 40 years was preparation in one way. The next 40 years was preparation in another way, more inward. First 40 years was more outward skills. The next 40 years was more inward development, humility, uh, of, just a quiet meditation. I mean, how many days did he spend when he did not speak to another human? Maybe most of his days of his 40 years, he didn't speak to another human, maybe his wife, his sons, or, whatever eventually. But my point is the 40 years trained in Egypt and the 40 years in the desert. So now he's prepared by God to go back to Egypt, but he's not totally prepared, is he? He's not totally prepared yet. That puzzling story in chapter 4 of Exodus, but on the way back they stopped at a lodging place, and it says that God intended to kill him. You think, why would God kill him? God's the one who called him and prepared him and spent 40 years investment into Moses' life, and now he's going to kill him. But Moses, there was one thing, and a lot of times there's one thing hang up in our life that's keeping us from being used by God in a way that he wants to. And evidently him and his wife had a difference of opinion regarding circumcision. And Moses was where circumcision was not being practiced. He married a woman where maybe their culture did not practice circumcision, especially as a sign of covenant relationship with God. So he was going back to deliver a circumcised nation in God's sight, separated unto him. But he had not circumcised his son. And immediately his wife knew why God was going to kill him. It didn't have to be told, so evidently this was an issue in their marriage. And she right away circumcised her son. She was angry about it. She threw the foreskin at Moses, said, "You're a bloody husband to me." And she got sent back to her father. And it's interesting in chapter 18, when they finally come back to where Jethro is, his father-in-law, it says Jethro brought Moses' wife and sons out to him. But something interesting, the wording of all that story, verses 2-6 of chapter 18, he goes out and greets and salutes Jethro and brings him in and has a long discussion with him. But it says nothing about his interaction with his wife and sons in that story. So we're not told if they rejoined Moses for the rest of the journey or they stayed with their father or her father, which that seems to be, because they're not really mentioned the rest of the way. And, at some point, maybe his sons were not really, maybe we are told in some of the chronologies or some of the genealogies or something. I forget right now, but to me, that's a sad, sad story that Moses being called to this great calling, and he had to do it without his wife and his
Mm-hmm.
sons. Uh, and evidently, it seems like there was a marriage separation of some type, that she did not accept what God demanded of his people, and it affected their marriage. I'd like to think that the marriage got patched up and they went along with him and everything, but I don't think we're told or even hinted at. Maybe I'm overlooking something. I'd really appreciate some of you pointing it out. I may have to back up on some of that, but just as to me, it's a sad story. I would also point out, maybe Steve would build on this a little bit, when he did finally go back to Egypt, and now he had Aaron as a spokesman and all that, and he went in and talked to Pharaoh, and he met with the elders of the Israelites, and so he was trying to line up both groups, his own people, Israel, and Pharaoh and the Egyptians. But things went south, and Pharaoh, he said, "Let us go out in the wilderness and offer a sacrifice," and Pharaoh uh, took it in a negative way. He said they must have too much time on their hands. They're not working hard enough. They're being lazy. So I'm going to make them make bricks and not give them the straw. They have to go out and get the straw for themselves. And that really became a much heavier burden on Moses' own people. And so they blamed him, and Pharaoh was against him. Israel was against him. He's being rejected. And they were saying, if you say you're from God and you're here to deliver us, why have things gotten worse? And that's just another really good devotional thought, that people, they're saved, they get baptized, they join the church, they start trying to learn and grow and serve God, and then things go sideways in their life. And they think, well, I'm trying to do what's right, and things aren't working out so well. And it's really as important to understand that the Christian life brings on new sources of tribulations and trials and testings, and to 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 think of the Christian life as, now God's going to bless me, everything's going to go smooth, I'm not going to have any major crisis in my life, is really a wrong way to look at it. And if you try to look at it that way, then some major crisis comes along in your life, the death of a loved one, a big health setback, loss of jobs, just major things. Then you start blaming God. You say, God, I'm trying to do what's right, and how come things aren't going so well? And that's what was happening with Moses, with Israel. Uh, it didn't start out very well. He was kind of looking the opposite of what God's calling in his life was. And that's why the Bible tells us we walk by faith and not by sight. We can't look at the circumstances of the moment and conclude whether God is pleased with us or not. It doesn't quite work that way. In fact, I tell people, when they experience God's salvation, they get baptized, come to the church, new members, they're all on fire. I warn them that now Satan's going to be after you. Your flesh nature is going to be after you. People are going to arise and try to do you harm. Don't take that as a sign that you're either living in sin, God has rejected you, or that you don't have a real testimony of faith, or else things will be going smoother. It's just really important to understand that uh, the Christian life has its own sources of troubles that arise because of your faith. And Jesus talked a lot about that. You're not above your master. Bad things happen to your master, bad things are going to happen to his servants. But you're to follow me no matter whether things are going smooth or rough. And I know Steve has spoken about that a lot in devotionals and lessons through the years. He might have something to say about that.
I was thinking that it's been difficult times in my life that I'm kind of wondering about the plan of God and where's this going, that have caused me to get deeper and wider in my faith and my experience. And thinking about the Hebrews in the land of Goshen, if things didn't go south, if things hadn't gone bad, would they be as willing to go? In other words, God was bringing them to the point when Moses instructed them about the Passover and be ready, be packed, we're going to get out of here. Would they have been willing to prepare and to do all that if things hadn't got as hard as they had gotten? So again, the principle in my life is when very difficult times come and I keep my eyes straight and I try to keep moving forward, the corner is turned, and I realize looking back that I may have not come to that better place unless I went through the difficult time. And there was a couple, it's kind of the side by side things going on here, to where what was happening during those plagues was judgment on Pharaoh and on Egypt and even on the land. But at the same time, the children of Israel in the land of Goshen, this wasn't affecting them negatively. And they didn't have to do nothing. It wasn't because of the greatness of their own strength that these first 9 were not affecting them. They would be able to see, and they knew people that it was affecting. And that should have been a big encouragement to them that, okay, it's difficult, but Moses says we're going to get out of here. It looks like we're going to get to go back to the promised land. But I was reminded of the 10th plague. In the 10th plague, the first 9, they had to do nothing. In the 10th plague, it took some action from them. It took the stepping out on the faith. Where the first 9 it was just blessings upon them or lack of cursings upon them, and they had to do nothing. But there are times in our life to where we're asked, okay, show me your works, your faith by your works, as James would say. You need to do a few things in order to follow God's will for the next step. So anyway, that thought came to me during those plagues and their preparation for the exit. That it took both. It took the judgment on Egypt and the observation from the Hebrews that God does make a difference between us and them.
So there's so much about that. All the plagues, of course. He said in 12:12 Exodus that against all the gods of Egypt I will execute judgment. And every one of those plagues was directed toward a particular god of Egypt, so that one by one by one by one, God was showing he's the only true God, and every one of their gods, he was able to present a plague that showed he had power over their various gods. But yeah, that last one, the death of the firstborn, and of course, the part of the Passover purpose was to preserve the firstborn of the children of Israel. And there's a lot in this that we don't have time to get to today, but he separated the firstborn. The firstborn, we know throughout the Old Testament, talks about a double blessing, a special inheritance, a authority, special authority given, special responsibility given. And so part of that purpose of that last plague was for Israel to highlight the role of firstborn status and, in God's eyes, the role of a firstborn people. He had said earlier about the entire nation, Israel is my son, my firstborn. So he wanted all Israel to receive a firstborn inheritance, but not all Israel was in a position to receive it. And so he separated out the actual firstborn from among the nation to show this same principle that I'm trying to develop a firstborn people, even as an elect remnant within the whole. So all of that is involved in the Passover, and he is still trying to develop a firstborn people to receive the full inheritance of his firstborn son, his only begotten son, Jesus Christ. And in the book of Hebrews that tries to tie those things of the Old Testament to the New Testament calls us the church of the firstborn, because it is through a devotion to Christ, through his church, that he is developing a firstborn people to be part of a special inheritance people with his firstborn son. We call it the bride of Christ. And it is a smaller part of the whole of the children of God, of those who have professions of faith, but are not using their life of service properly or in the right place. And so they might be, we might call them second born, or, but still born, but not part of a firstborn people. And the Passover was all about developing a people for God's kingdom purpose, which is, that purpose is still in effect today. Steve was going to, we wish we had time to cover a lot more today. There is a lot more to say about the plagues and about his time in Egypt and about his birth and all of that. But Steve wanted to bring up a few things about the Song of Moses that was sung after they crossed the Red Sea. And before he does that, I would just say in general, we don't normally think of Moses as we do David, a psalm writer, a songwriter, a musical kind of person. But he wrote several songs here, Deuteronomy 30, 32, Psalm number 90. So he was more musical than we give him credit for. And the Song of Moses in Exodus 15 is a great part of the story. So why don't you say a few things, Steve?
Well, in addition to those three that you mentioned, we have Revelations 15 refers to the Song of Moses and the Song of the Lamb. So there's again another indicator that there's more songs about that Moses wrote that they're not recorded for us to read, but as mentioned in Revelations, apparently that was a song that some of them would know, and some of them could refer to the Song of Moses. So I did want to mention again the emphasis on God being with them the entire way. The trap that they felt like maybe they were in at the Red Sea, and then they crossed it and saw the great victory that the Lord provided. And it's when they got on the other side of that Red Sea that they broke out in song. And they broke out in song because in the end of the 14th chapter, it says, the Lord saved Israel that day out of the hand of the Egyptians. And Israel saw the Egyptians dead on the seashore. Thus Israel saw the great work which the Lord had done in Egypt. So the people feared the Lord and believed God and his servant Moses. And then I would say, so they broke out in song. They broke out in song just for joy. And that recorded song or psalm in Exodus 15 is it starts off with I will. And it uses the term I will at least 14 times in that song, as we've pointed out before in past studies. But that I will kind of carries the idea, when I read it, for the joy that they were experiencing is I must. I can't contain myself. The song that they were singing was joy and gladness and appreciation because they saw what the Lord did for them. They saw that saw what the Lord had done to the Egyptians. They're now safe on this side of the Red Sea. They broke out in song. And I've experienced that sometimes in my life, to where I just can't contain myself. And the way we're able to express that mostly in our churches and our church services today is the way we sing. I'm the song director at Liberty, and I've experienced the times when I just know that the congregation is filling the song. They're filling the words of the song. They're expressing by song the joy or the gladness or the appreciation or the love that they have for the Lord. And songs that we may sing about his amazing grace, his deliverance in our lives. There are some times when we come to that realization that we just have to break out in song. And what a great way for them at that point, them moving forward, and their next generations to know and to remember what God had done for them. at the crossing of the Red Sea. I mean, it covers the entire event. And songs, I remember words and songs, unfortunately, more often than I do scripture. When it's put to music and it's a song that we sing various times in our services, we can close our eyes a lot of times and not have to even look at the words. We know them, and so it's a way to memorize the truth of scriptures, the blessings of God. And we read in that 15th chapter about salvation. We read in chapter 13, you're guiding us to your holy habitation. I mean, isn't that the desire that God has for all of us? He's guiding us to his holy habitation. And then when we get to Deuteronomy 32, which is 40 years after this song, at the end of Moses' life, he says in verse 7 of that chapter 32, it's a song of remembrance. Remember the old days. Don't forget. Tell it to your children. Sing songs to them. And then Psalms 90, when I did a little research on that, may be the oldest psalm recorded in the book of Psalms. And when you think about the writers of the songs in the book of Psalms, that kind of makes sense that it would be the oldest. But Moses says in that chapter 90 of that psalm, Lord, you have been our dwelling place in all generations. And a verse that we've kickoff verse maybe for a devotional would be verse 12. Teach us to number our days, that we may gain a heart of wisdom. Well, some of us have carried that thought even a little bit farther, and not only to teach us to number our days, but Lord, teach us to make the days count that you've given us. That would be an added thought for a devotional. So a lot of thoughts could be expressed through these songs. They're great to read. I would encourage you to read them through slowly. If you're a devotional leader or a teacher, there's a lot of springboard verses in these songs that you can springboard into your 30 or 40 minute devotional time that you may have. So anyway, there's a lot to be said about these songs of Moses, and apparently there's some evidences that he wrote more that we don't have recorded. So that's my thought on the songs today.
Good, thank you. That verse you read in 1431, when they were on the other side of the Red Sea, standing there looking back, and God closed the Red Sea on the army of the Egyptians and drowned them, even to where their bodies washed up on shore. So not only were they separated physically from Egypt at that point, but the armies of Egypt could not come after them. They were destroyed. And, we're not told, and, whenever history is written, you usually don't write about your defeats, you write about your victories. But can you imagine how disruptive to the whole nation of Egypt? You're losing your firstborn of your animals and your sons, which is extremely major in itself, and then your entire army gets wiped out. What kind of power vacuum would that cause? Did Pharaoh survive that? We're not really told. I guess Pharaoh may have died in the Red Sea, or maybe not. Kind of unclear in some ways, but how would you continue after that? How would you have a nation follow you after such a disaster? You think there'd be an overthrow of the ruling group. But that 1431, I've called it the great baptism verse of the Old Testament, because they applied the blood so they escaped death. And even though they were following Moses, but they were still in Egypt, and Pharaoh still had a certain amount of power over them. So when 1 Corinthians 10 says that they were baptized into or unto Moses, that's when he became their clear, unarguable leader. And I think that's true in baptism today, is that we apply the blood, We call it salvation. Our sins are forgiven. It's a great deliverance, and we rejoice in it. But it's really in the act of baptism that we're declaring, I'm going to devote the rest of my life to my new leader, that the world doesn't have hold on me anymore, or Egypt. And what they felt on that far shore looking back should be, to some degree, what a person feels when they come up out of the baptism waters, because uh, mostly, not all the time, but mostly it happens very soon after your salvation experience, maybe within a week or so. So it's still fresh in your mind. You're thinking about your deliverance, your forgiveness, your salvation. But when you come up out of that water, you're just kind of capturing that whole thing of celebration. Steve said breaking out into song, because it really is a celebration of a person now moving forward under the leadership of a new leader in their life and devoted to him. I had a man at the gym I used to go to. He was a longtime minister like me, and he wrote a little book. I really liked the title, and he was applying it to the crossing of the Red Sea and to New Testament baptism. And the title of his little book was called "Now That You're Dry." So now that you're dry, what do you do? Now that you come up out of baptism, what's the rest of your life supposed to be like? I would say one other thing. I know we're kind of going maybe a little bit over today, but we're always trying to look for Christ. We're looking for gospel verses. We're looking for verses that are a blessing to us as New Testament Christians. And at the end of chapter 15, when they came 3 days into the wilderness and they found no water, and they came to a place called Mara, but they could not drink the waters of Mara, for they were bitter. So that's what Mara means, which is what Naomi said to call her when she came back. So the people complained and, of course, did their usual thing against Moses and against God. And my son-in-law, Vince Quilici, when he was a new convert, and he took us on a men's retreat up to their family cabin, and he gave a devotional. And that was the first time that this really just jumped out at me and grabbed hold of me. It's so powerful of a gospel verse. So they complain against Moses. The waters are bitter. There's no other water around. They're thirsty. And verse 25 is that verse, 15:25. So he cried out to the Lord, and the Lord showed him a tree. When he cast it into the waters were made sweet. And boy, you apply that to, uh, in my case, and I was there when it happened to my brother Steve too. When I cried out to the Lord, when I was thirsty spiritually, I was dry. I cried out to the Lord, and what did He show me? He showed me a tree called Calvary, and that tree turned my bitter water sweet. And it was a day I think about often. I hold very special. I know Steve's given his testimony too, but I mean, what a great gospel thought in that. Cry out to the Lord, and He'll show you the solution. And the solution is a tree. And that tree makes your bitter water sweet. So that's kind of my closing thought that I wanted to leave with everyone. You have something to close with, Steve?
Yes, I appreciate our time together. Hopefully there was something said that can spark an interest, and if we would definitely welcome any of you that already have done some studies, as you mentioned earlier, that have put some of these thoughts together, or some exhaustive studies on what we covered today. I'd love for you to send that our way. There's a lot more that could be said, obviously, regarding what we covered today, but that's the time frame we have. So
yeah, we're doing our best.
Something was said.
Yeah, we're doing our best to do what we said in the beginning, and we did it today. All the dates and details and all of that of the timing of events. But we tried to mix in a lot of devotional thoughts so that it can appeal in some way, parts of it, to all of you, and be a blessing to you. And we hope to have that kind of mix all the way through, which means we're going to have to overlook some things along the way, because we just don't have the time. And so join us in this journey, Give us some feedback if you'd like. Um, I'll send out an email letting everyone know when this is posted, and hopefully you'll have time to watch it and enjoy it and get some benefit from it. So thank you to my brother in the flesh and brother in the spirit for all his information today, and we will stop our recording.